Thank you ever so much for coming. I'm only going to talk for 25 minutes, so we can do lots of hopefully short questions and short answers, because I think that's more interesting than you hearing me. I'll start though by reading out what I said I was going to do, because at least it keeps me slightly focused, so you get something of what you are expecting to hear. I'm going to start off quite optimistic. I don't know if I'm going to end optimistic, but I'm going to start that way. So this is titled "There Are Always Alternatives," and it's a geographer's take on political opinions and options. Now, I'm not going to talk about if we all got together we could get this. I'm not going to talk about utopian alternatives or really progressive alternatives. I'm going to talk about the fact that things actually do tend to change much more quickly than you think, and circumstances that were thought to be impossible often turn out not to be within 10 or 20 years of when it was said that can't possibly happen. And also, very, very often, lots of things get better. It's just that we tend not to notice them or not to worry about the things that are getting better. We focus laser-like on the things that are getting worse. But that has a problematic effect on us because it tends to make us quite depressed about what's going to happen. You may well disagree with me. You may well say it's absolutely awful and it's game over and there won't be any humans on the planet in 100 years' time. That's why I'm keeping this to just 25 minutes, in case you do. In the blurb, and of course I don't know the answers to the future. Writing books about the future is a kind of fool's errand, is what I discovered. The next crisis is an attempt, not actually to say what the next crisis is, but to look at people's concerns now about the future. That's hard enough. The book I'm currently working on, which hopefully my editor will like, he's got it, he's told me he's got it, he hasn't told me he likes it, is about the future of human beings. And I discovered over writing that for a year how stupid it is to try and write about the future. And I'll get onto that right at the end. The blurb. In 1926, the Prime Minister claimed, "The general strike is a challenge to Parliament and is the road to anarchy and ruin." In the 1920s, by the way, we had more strikes, more hours lost to strike than at any other time. It absolutely dwarfs the 1970s. 1970s, I think Margaret Thatcher first said there is no alternative, actually in the 1970s, before she became famous for saying it in the 80s. You know, this idea you just have to do it one way. Keir Starmer, 2024, there is no alternative. I'd love to know who wrote that for him, but there is no alternative. Change takes time. In every case, there always was an alternative. Quite often the alternatives happen. I'm a geographer, so one of the alternatives I'll tell you about is just geographic. If you think there is no alternative to economic policy in the UK, you have the rest of Europe to look at. We have, despite having the highest taxes for 70 years, which is correct, we have the lowest taxes and lowest spend of almost any country in Europe. So the idea that you couldn't do something better, as long as you're happy, with the idea of actually funding things through taxation, is a bit silly, given that countries nearby have managed to do that. In all cases, an alternative way transpires, the world changes, but not often in the way that people want. A sense of crisis. How long do you think we've been in a crisis for? Does anybody want to give me a start date? Imagine it's the first graph in this book, The Next Crisis, right? So I've got the answer. Okay, good. Imagine you look at how often the word crisis is used in the English language, and in French and German, by the way, but mainly in English. And you're going to look all the way from the 1820s when we can begin onwards. What year does the use of the word crisis begin to rise really rapidly? Or what decade? What decade?
80s.
Not the 80s, it's not bad.
60s, 50s.
Very good.
Yeah.
1960s. With the Cuban Missile Crisis. Beginning of the use of the word crisis. But then, if you've got very good eyesight, I try no longer to give talks with slides because people hate graphs, but I've got to show you. Got good eyesight, you'll see the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010s, each set of crises were even bigger than the ones before. And before the 1960s, we had utopia. No crises. It was absolutely big. It was a tiny little rise in the 1930s, like a little bit of a worry of something going badly wrong in the 1930s, but no, it was just all, sweetness and honey. Now obviously it wasn't. Right? You go back to the 1820s, and you have constant epidemics, constant pandemics, far, far more than we have now. We've never had fewer pandemics than we have now. I like counting things, like some sort of security. The 2019 pandemic, December 2019, we don't even know when the last coronavirus pandemic was. We now have an idea that there must have been one. Like the common cold didn't come in naturally, but we don't know. It could have been the 1890s. The last pandemic before COVID, that was serious, there was a tiny bit of flu in 2010. Do you remember all that Tamiflu? Was AIDS. That was serious and a big one. You have to go back to 1968, if any of you can remember getting flu in 1968. It wasn't good, but it was only just a pandemic. 1957, there was a flu pandemic, during which Macmillan, good old cue, Macmillan, who was the Prime Minister in 1957, told people in the week when the flu pandemic was reaching its height, you've never had it so good. Because the flu pandemic goes up in 5 weeks, down in 5 weeks. Okay? 1918 was a big one. But this last 100 years of pandemics has been the lowest ever of mass infectious diseases. Cholera, typhoid. Millions of people dying of measles and so on in the past. It's far worse. And there were wars, endless wars across Europe. Endless disasters. So something altered. So by the 1960s, we could become really worried about what was happening in the world, despite the fact that what was happening in most people's lives, things like bad harvests and so on, were not occurring. We had the luxury. We had the luxury of time. We'd become literate, more and more of us. We had rising numbers of university graduates. We had people able to worry about these things. I think that's partly part of what went on. Before then, we didn't have the luxury, we didn't have enough time, we didn't have periods of quiet and peace, certainly not peace in Europe, to actually become very, very scared. This rise in crisis happens long before worrying about climate change occurs. And that makes me optimistic. The reason I like the graph, by the way, is that it ends in 2019. So you can be absolutely sure that when it's updated, because of what happened in 2020, we reach a new, if you can remember 2020, right? The world's ending. But that was nothing as compared to Donald Trump being elected for a second term, right? Now, I'm not saying that any of this isn't serious. I'm just saying that if you step back a little bit and look at it, you can see that we get transfixed by now. That our problems are really, really big in the way that our great-grandparents or great-grandparents did not. They weren't so melancholy. They didn't think that it was coming to an end in so many ways. Let me tell you what's in the book in case you don't buy it. I try to work out what the main crises are in the world that most people think of as a crisis. Now, there are people paid to actually tell you what the biggest crises are, and even better, are going to be in the next year. They're called chief risk officers of companies. And every year at Davos, they produce a prediction. And they tend, thankfully, to get it wrong. But they worry about things like viruses taking over computer systems, which happens occasionally. The biggest crisis, when people are presented with about 18 options by Ipsos Mori in about 30 countries, which include India, and a very similar set of lists by the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in China every couple of years. The options that people tick, above all else for what is a concern to them in the country they live in is inequality, poverty, that's one joint option, and cost of living in the last few years. And those two are number 1 and 2, and they're very similar. So the giveaway of the book is that actually if you survey people, the one thing that comes up above everything else, and the people who fill in surveys tend to be middle class, by which I mean over halfway through the distribution of income. You don't tend to fill in surveys when you can't actually put food on the table. But of people who fill in surveys, how am I going to get by? Having enough money. Not necessarily for you, but for your family or neighbours. And that's been the biggest concern for roughly the last decade. And it was absolutely cemented by the cost of living crisis, which of course is still with us. There hasn't been a single year in which inflation has gone negative. So we're all living with that 30% increase in fuel and food and so on. Now, kind of got used to it a little bit. We get used to these things. We get used to the fact that real wages have hardly risen since 2008. And it's interesting what we do get used to. That's number 1. Does anybody want to guess what number 2 is? Because I was really embarrassed because I didn't, and you can tell my privileged position back away that I didn't realise. Number 2 was 10, 15 years ago number 1. So 30 countries in the world, lots of European countries, a couple in Africa, a couple in South America, the USA. What's the second most concerning issue? And don't worry if you get it wrong, because I would not have got this.
Housing?
No, that's lower, interestingly. No, climate's much lower. Climate's about number 6.
War?
War's number 3. Well, hardly. Violence is number 3, but it's mainly robbery, burglary, and so on. And then I stick war and terrorism into that in the book. But they're lower. So but this is number 2. I'm glad you're not getting it, so I'm feeling less stupid and less privileged.
Inequality?
No, we had inequality as number 1.
Okay.
Health is kind of number 4, although it's number 1 in China. I've put immigration with this, that's a clue, but immigration is actually lower.
Population, increase of population.
No, not increase of population.
Cultural identity?
No.
Employment.
Who said that? Unemployment, thank you. Yes. Number 2 is unemployment.
What is number 2?
Number 2 is unemployment. The fear and worry about unemployment. Now, it's great when you do work like this, and it surprises you because then you've actually learned something. And I thought, how can it be? Because some of these countries, like the UK and USA, have really low rates of unemployment.
Is it fear of unemployment?
It's fear of it.
It's not just what percentage are you?
Yeah. It's the fear of it. And my students must be very privileged. They're incredibly worried about, is anybody going to want me? And maybe they're worried about getting certain jobs, but that's huge. Of course, the majority of my colleagues in most universities in the UK are currently worried about their jobs, because jobs are being cut at a rate that has never happened before in UK universities. Cut very quietly, because you do not say they're cutting jobs in my university, because if you say it, students won't come and then you're down. But yet, the fear that you could be, or the fear of others around you. It's interesting looking at surveys, because these are the terms. So first of all, cost of living and inequality and poverty, how am I going to get by? Which, if you like, is a very old worry. Like the poor have always been with us, but not necessarily, and it's fluctuated hugely. Number 2, unemployment. That's a relatively recent worry. We didn't really invent the word until the 1880s. There was no unemployment. It was, you basically starved or were put in the workhouse. And then number 3, violence, which is violence locally. It varies dramatically between countries, of course, and if you're in a country bordering a country at war, it's much higher. Number 4 is the housing, health services, education. Starts having to put them together with that, and it's down. And because I put them together, I can get climate up to number 5. We are the country in the world that worries more about climate than any other. We only have 10% of people here who are climate sceptic. 90% of people believe climate change is happening. It is happening, by the way. In case you're worried. And that shows the power of where we get our information from. Because there was a consensus between the political parties and the news broadcast not to two-side it. If you remember the beginnings of heat going up and reports, they used to put somebody on and went, well, this isn't really happening, or it's the El Nino. Right? They stopped doing that. And that has to be why we got to 90%. But it's distant. It's far away. It's affecting faraway places. And compared to the immediate problems, kind of how bad is it? The climate migrants have never turned up. We have migrants, we have refugees, they come from wars. Those wars are almost always not created by climate change. I've got a map of all the wars since 1989 in the book. And they're basically created by having the wrong colour skin, to put it very crudely. If you look at the deaths in the world, it's Syria, Afghanistan, Rwanda. It's all countries where people are not white, and it's games being played by rich countries who are playing war games over them. So climate crisis is a distant kind of concern of people. It's also quite hard to get it higher when currently only about 2% of people in the world die because of excessive heat. Not necessarily in the hottest countries, by the way. It's excessive heat in a country that's used to it being colder. About 2% of people who die because of that. And about 8% of people die because of excessive cold. So it's quite hard to convince people that this is the most terrible thing, given that. And then the last one in the book is the one which is permanent, which is species loss. Because climate change, 300, 400 years from now, unless we're absolutely on a death wish as a species, is not going to be occurring anymore because of us. That is almost certainly impossible. If you want some optimism about this, and I'm getting near to my time, so I should. China this year, for the first time ever, has an absolute fall in its carbon emissions. Unbelievable achievement. Yeah, it's possible. If you put your mind to it, produce enough solar panels, enough windmills, you can do it. And the whole of China has done that. It's going to rise, it's predicted to rise ever so slightly for a few years, peak before 2030 probably, down forever. We don't like talking about we're not very good about talking about good news stories from China, because that's a terrible place where they do everything wrong. And this is part of the problem about being depressed about alternatives, because you're not told about them. To keep to my promise, just to give you one at the end, the big worry about inequality and poverty, cost of living. There are lots of European countries that control prices in lots of ways to actually stop the cost of living becoming unaffordable. Control the prices of fuel. Control the prices of housing. You're not allowed. Rent control right across this continent, just not here. You're probably aware of the 5 Nordic countries, always put forward by people like me. You know, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, how well people do there, how equitable education is and so on. There are another 5 countries, mainly quite small in Europe, include Belgium, which are now more equal than the Nordic 5, but much more exciting than that. And nobody ever says my country's good. Much more exciting, there are another 5 countries in Europe which are now almost as equal in terms of income inequality to the Nordic countries. And those 5 countries include France and Germany. So you've got 15 European countries which are Nordic. You have 3 weird countries on the edge. The UK, which is the most unequal apart from Bulgaria. Yeah, by income. Russia, a little bit, which is in Europe, which is slightly more unequal than the UK, and that's a huge capital, Moscow, like London, was the other heart of the former empire. And then the other is Turkey, which is very unequal with Istanbul, and another heart of the former empire. So we are strange. If you look at what's happening here, you could despair, but we are on an absolutely extreme when it comes to what is possible and what can be done. And good things happen. Yeah, because the President in the United States decided he wanted to throw 10,000 dead cats on the table, 3 million pieces of paper were released, and we discovered that one of the main architects of New Labour, the campaign director, I think, in the 1987 general election, in effect Deputy Prime Minister under Gordon Brown, our ambassador to Washington, we find out what some people may have always suspected, but no longer is he being defended anymore. Right? It might annoy you that it takes a little bit of time, and it's good, I think, to be annoyed. You don't get progress without people saying it's not good enough. But my challenge to you is to say, in general, most things, inequality is falling in most of Europe at the moment. Prospect magazine, I got a message today, published an article yesterday, saying that we've actually had a fall in income inequality in this country, which was first registered in 2018, and it's continued. Hardly noticed at all. So generally things get better, but people tend not to know it. So I'll just tell you what I've been working on, and it's been hardest, most recently in Stop. What I've been working on most recently is trying to work out why are people having fewer children? Which is a stupid thing for an old man to look at, I discovered, and particularly stupid to try to guess what's happening in future. But right at the moment, we've been having fewer children since the 1960s, worldwide. It's dropping almost everywhere. The number of children people have is dropping everywhere. In the countries where people have 5, it's dropping to 4. It's dropping faster in the countries where they have more than it's happening before. We're at 1.4 children per couple, our lowest ever, our biggest drop we've ever seen in the last year. Scotland's the same. India's dropped to 1.9 for the first time last year. China's down to 1 again, and its biggest drop in births again in the last year. Fastest. So it's not just that the births are going down, they're going down faster. And it's really hard to work out why. There are thousands and thousands of studies, and lots of people are asked. People talk about the price of housing, or talk about men are crap, which is just understandable, but there's a lot about men are crap, and it's taken me too long to find a man who might hang around with me. And there are lots of slightly idiosyncratic theories about things like sperm counts that aren't true. But what I think it is, but I can't prove, is I think it's concern for the future. And just as we saw the word crisis begin to rise in the 1960s and 70s, because people who buy magazines and books wanted to buy more magazines and books and news stories with the word crisis in it, our youngsters today, in their 20s and 30s, now have an impending sense that the world is not going in a good direction. They don't always articulate it, some do, but it's easier when you're really worried about the future to put it off another year, to not have a child then, or to actually decide you don't want to have one, or to have one rather than 2. So I'm not saying that there isn't a sense of worry out there. I think, in fact, it's having this enormous effect, which we can prophesy because we know how many babies have been born up to 2025. so we know how many people are going to be aged 40 and 80 in the future. We know that for the first time in human history, currently the UN says at some point in the 2080s, I suspect it will be in the 2070s, that the number of human beings on the planet will fall for the first time in our history. But the interesting thing, and I wouldn't worry about it too much, because it's quite a long way, it doesn't just fall, it goes like this. And down and down and down. There's nowhere where it is going up again at the moment. And the effect is first felt most strongly in the places where it's been fastest, which are in the Far East, which we thought was odd. Korea, Japan, we said, oh, that's strange. Turns out they're just ahead of time. And Europe, and now the USA. So something like 800 primary schools are going to be closing in London in the next few years. That's just the first 800. You've got to think about this forward. It's not necessarily a problem. It would be good, I think, if the world got better to a point where people who want to have children feel they can have them. By the time people are age 50, in 10 rich countries, including ours, half, I think 55% of people by 50 say they wish they'd had a child or they'd had one more. Only 5% say they had too many. So I'm not saying that the world is wonderful. I'm just saying that we tend not to realise that things get better because we concentrate on some of the awful people in charge of us. And the more we know about them, the worse we feel. And we don't notice the quiet people, including many members of Parliament, who actually do make little things better all the time and it's not noticed. And you can tell they've made things better because you can actually measure the outcomes. And in simple ways. Just what's the child's chances of getting to age 18? Are the number of crashes on the roads going down? Have we got fewer cases of cancer? There are lots and lots of ways in which you can measure progress. In general, in most of the world, progress is rising, human rights are getting better, women's rights are getting better. We focus on somewhere like the USA and say they're getting worse. It's great that we do, but we don't tend to notice that for most things, most of the time, it's not getting worse. And that worries me, because if I'm right, that a key reason for falling rates of birth, accelerating falls in rates of birth worldwide, a key reason is real despair about the future, then we drop much faster than we might otherwise in the number of people. And it's really, really hard to run cities when the population falls very fast. If any of you ever lived in Glasgow, which halved in population, or in Liverpool, I lived for 10 years in Sheffield. I used to take my son, who's now 25, 24? Sorry, 24. 24. Terrible. When he was 2, I used to take him to watch tower blocks being blown up. Because in Sheffield they blew up tower blocks. Until he started pointing at them and going, tower block goes bang. but it's that, when you see a tower block being blown up, all around is a crowd of people who used to live there and it's their home. When you're watching the streets of terraced houses being pulled down, it's really, really expensive. Right? So don't get utopic about the idea of lower populations. It's where it's happened in the world. It's happened in parts of the UK. Thankfully, due to immigration, we haven't had to blow any power blocks up recently. But nobody connects the two. They don't go, thankfully, because people actually came to this godforsaken, cold, misty, miserable island, we stopped having to demolish our housing. It's never said. Last one to end on, over how fast things can change. In December, again, for the first time ever, our net migration rate, dropped by 400,000 people. A little bit because of government policies, but also not worth coming here. And nobody said this could be really, really bad news. Going from 600,000 net to just 200,000 in 1 year, that carries on. It's great for bringing house prices down, but unless any of you are planning to base your retirement on selling a house. But these very, very, very rapid changes lead to crisis and lead to disasters. I've gone past my time. Please ask me some questions. If you keep your questions short, I'll try really hard to keep my answers short. Thank you.
I want to pick you up on, you said you're a numbers person. I'm also a numbers person. But I have a sense that numbers are going out of fashion. You know, the politics today isn't, and you know, public debate is not very influenced by numbers and evidence.
Yeah.
It's about vibes. I wondered what your thoughts are on that.
I've watched over time the BBC get down to a point of only having bar graphs with 2 bars. The best night for numbers on the BBC is election night, because they've got to fill 2-3 hours before you know anything. There is, I think people like evidence, but they are really turned off by graphs and numbers too much. So the 7 Children book I've written is about 7 fictional children telling their lives rather than going through the statistics, because I thought you needed to do that. But it's short-term attention spans. You know, that's the big change that's occurred. You know, my children watch on their phone. They won't watch on TV so much. I was in Shanghai in January last year, watching people watching 2-minute videos, because more than 2 minutes is too much. It's a change that's occurring in terms of attention. I think the other thing that's occurred, maybe, and I might be a bit snobby about this, is when we expanded university entry, we mainly put more and more of the middle class into universities. And very often they were not very good at doing maths, but they had to have a degree. And so they absolutely hate maths because it's the way you can be found out in the UK. And partly we teach it really badly. And so we know this because at PISA do a test at age 24 across Europe. We do okay at age 16. But at age 24, we have some of the worst maths ability in Europe. Because what we do is we teach people to get what used to be called an A, which is an 8 or a 9, or a C, which is whatever, 5, at GCSE maths. On a day. Just that day. And it's a really... But that's us. American newspapers have more graphs in them, interestingly, than we do. I promise to keep the next one shorter.
David Attenborough tells us not to have children, doesn't he? In his programme, he says it will help the climate.
He does.
So, isn't the population growing in Africa?
It is thankfully growing in Africa. It's growing, but not. So it's growing in Africa by an additional 1 billion people. This is quite crude. But linked in the 80s, we enacted a thing called structural adjustment on Africa. So we made African countries pay debt back, and we made them liberalise their economies and privatise their water supply, and we made them poorer. And one effect of that was that girls were less likely to go to secondary school. And if girls go to secondary school less often, they're more likely to become mothers earlier. And this is kind of lucky. Not for Africa, but it got us an extra 1 billion people. Which means that the slowdown won't be like that. It'll be like that. But there's only about 8 countries in the world that are going to account for population growth in the future. And I think 7 of those are in Africa. And that just keeps us going. It's very hard to explain this. In a world in which people are worried about small boats, trying to explain, once you're down to 1.4 children per couple, the question is at what point you get a bigger boat, you send it out and you actually bring people in, which is what Enoch Powell argued for in the 1960s, when Enoch Powell went to the Caribbean to try to get people to come over to work for the NHS. Enoch Powell went to Pakistan to try to get people, it's now Pakistan, to get people to come and work in factories. He then changed his tune. But it's like the Pied Piper of Hamelin's been here. Right? The children were never born. it's not a prediction. We didn't have them. Either people come, or we start knocking down buildings, and it's happened in the past. So in the 1930s, there was a really big drop in people having babies because we had mass unemployment as well. So what we did, and we didn't realise we did it this way, is that we invited people who'd been born in the 1930s into Britain in the 1960s. So we plugged the gap. There was another small fall in the 1970s. Well, it fell from the 60s, but in the 70s. And again, immigration 20, 30 years later was encouraged to fill the gap. But, yeah, the group of folk like David Attenborough tend to be older. And we've gone from, in 1968, people producing a book called The Population Bomb, to now the words population bomb actually meaning a lack of people. In a really, really short time. So it's no wonder it's confusing. In 1968, human population was rising by 2.1% a year. Its fastest percentage rate ever in the history of humanity. Somebody predicted in 1968 that if it continued to increase at that point within a couple of 100 years, the entire planet would be a seething mass of humans all touching each other. But what they were really explaining was that this can't carry on, that 2.1 was the maximum, which it was. Well, to give you one last example of these weird statistics where you can tell something odd's happening. There were a few years where in Kensington and Chelsea, life expectancy was going up by more than a year. Like going up, I don't know, from 79 for men to 80.5 in a year, and then from 80.5 to 83. Now what that tells you is that either people in Kensington and Chelsea are going to become immortals, and it will be Mount Olympus, or you're seeing something really weird. What was happening was migration. It was extremely rich people moving in. It was already quite posh. The last of the people who were poor, or most of them, not being able to stay there. And so a changing population, which couldn't carry on forever. I'm breaking my rule over short answers.
Yeah. You said that across Europe there's a decline, right? Even though, right, in this country is one of the ones where inequality is widened.
Yeah.
But in these countries, a lot of them, inequality has lessened or become less extreme. Is there a difference between Britain as a result of austerity?
Of austerity since 2010. Is that the difference?
Is that a secondary factor in the decline? Is there a difference between Britain and the other countries in Europe where there's less inequality?
Yeah.
That's basically what I'm asking.
Yeah, that's the question. The short answer is no, that isn't the key thing. By around about 1977-76, we were the second most equal large country to Sweden. So we were almost Nordic. And then from the late 70s onward, we had this huge increase in inequality that reached a plateau around about 95, 96. And then it stayed flat, really, really high. And the fascinating thing was that what was key in that was New Labour. New Labour comes in 1997 and doesn't reduce inequality by one iota. Austerity, it managed to move 1 million kids from just over the poverty line to just under it, but by such a small amount that it didn't alter our Gini coefficient of income inequality, or that many of the families actually noticed any difference to their lives. Austerity doesn't come till 2010, 2011, 2012, and we still we're like that. It was nasty, and our austerity was bigger than other European countries, and we saw rising death rates in older people. So life expectancy peaked in 2014 and then went down in 15, 16, 17, 18. And all the time, people are arguing, saying, no, this isn't happening, which was really annoying. If you're trying to say, look, it is going down. So life expectancy hasn't fallen in other European countries. 3-year-olds in Britain have had a rising mortality rate. That doesn't happen in other European countries. But we're more callous. We have a bigger gap. The best of 10% of us take 40% of all income. That leaves 60% of all income for 90% of people to live on. And apart from Bulgaria, nobody else does it like that. But austerity was a part of this. But before austerity, we were not repairing, we were not reducing the inequalities. The famous phrase was something like, "I'm extremely comfortable with the rich being rich as long as they pay their taxes." Yeah.
Okay, I'm clear about your description of what's happened in Britain, but my question was about the comparison with other European countries. And okay, I wasn't asking whether that was the key factor, because your argument is it's actually a subjective thing about people's attitude towards crises. I'm saying is, in your argument, do you accept it as a secondary factor?
A secondary, no, objectively.
The differential between Britain and other European countries in relation to austerity?
Our austerity was, ours was nasty. George Osborne, you could join the Star Chamber as a minister if you cut more than other ministers. He introduced. But the income inequality falling in other countries is a measurable thing, and it's not necessarily subjective. So most people in most countries where things are getting better don't know they're getting better. If I do a talk in Norway and say how good it is, people will say I don't understand all the terrible things that the current government is doing. Or a talk in Finland where they have a government which is on their political right, which means far to the left of Jeremy Corbyn in terms of actual policies. But everywhere you go to, people say that things are bad. And that isn't necessarily that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it means that they're not complacent. They're worried. The place where people used to be least likely to say things are bad, of rich countries, used to be the United States. But things have changed so much in the United States that you don't have that anymore. The current country where people are most optimistic is India. And I think that shows the effect of Modi's government able to make the population think that things are really good. Because when you measure things in India, they have got worse in many ways to what they were. So you can, for a time, influence the population despite the reality on the ground. But it's pretty rare. And most people in most European countries are not happy with the way things are run, even though often the situation is better than it was 10 or 20 years ago.
Someone here.
Okay, it's great to hear your stats, but what do we do about the fact that right-wing Labour leadership, Tories, Reform, all lie constantly about the number of people coming in votes, which is minute. It's the same number every day come from Sudan into Chad, from a war that's largely created by imperialism 100 years ago till now, has come every year on boats here. And then Mr. Clearsprings is making 4.8 million a day, ripping off migrants and the government, putting people in hotels. Yeah. George Brown had a completely different policy. I'm not saying it was great, but he was better. So that, and now the sort of stats you're quoting of population dropping, the fact that we have, well, you didn't mention benefits, but benefits, we have the lowest percentage GDP in Europe spent on benefits. Yeah. The numbers, unfortunately, migrants and non-British nationals are in receipt of a minute percentage of benefits. And yet these lies are perpetrated constantly. Yeah. And there's nothing to counter it. Apart from Zach Polanski makes a bit of an attempt, and one or two other people in The Guardian, but apart from that, the whole population thinks, well, not the whole population, there is this unfortunate rise of reform, who are being convinced of all these lies.
Yeah. Now, I agree with you very much, and we should say the default for our politicians has been to lie. That most of them have lied most of the time about things that really matter, despite appearing often to be quite sincere. So I covered government taking £4 million from a hedge fund and claiming it has no influence on it. But you do get politicians who don't lie and don't connive. There are two relatively recent Labour leaders who would not work with Peter Mandelson. They were John Smith and Jeremy Corbyn. And you need to say there were two who would not work with him because they could work out like what he was doing. And those who did work with him were not so stupid that they didn't work out what his politics really were. They're not that stupid. And I think you've got to say it. Yes, you can convince, whatever it is, about 36% of people who say they're going to vote to tick reform, and reform could well win the next election. If Labour continue as it is, that's where we're heading. But we have lost, in the last week, the Prime Minister's main advisor, whose policy, as far as I can see, was to make Labour as near to reform as possible, and then to tell people, this is your choice, which one are you going to go for? Well, he's gone. Right? So it wasn't that the choice was either Labour or reform and they're going to be very similar, hold your nose. The choice actually was that the advisor went. So things are better. Young people look at their phones, they get their news in different ways, and they can see a reality of what's going on in the world. Right? And it's very different from what older people tend to think. But this is to generalise, but the age distribution in these votes are quite incredible. When you ask older people why it is that they might vote reform, or why the majority of them voted for Brexit, what you find is that they say it's not for them. They're concerned about their children and their grandchildren. But that's at least heartwarming slightly, that it's not so much for them. But explaining to them this is not going to help your children and your grandchildren is harder. But I think you just need to call it out and say, yes, people very, very often lie, have got used to lying, don't even know that they're lying anymore. In hindsight. Yes. But there wasn't a time when we were governed by a set of people who were so crystal clear and lovely, and that's gone. That didn't exist. And there was a time when we were becoming more equal, when people from political parties I don't particularly like the Liberals and I don't like the Conservatives, but there was a time when the Rowntree family, and Seymour Rowntree in particular, advised William Beveridge, who is a Liberal, on producing one of the most dramatic reports in Europe and one of the best systems, and the Conservative Health Minister aided creating a National Health Service. And we tend to tell ourselves a story of it's just an Iron Bevan and the left. But when things got better, faster, it was more collective. When they get worse faster, it's because all your politics has moved towards the nasty. And I'd just call it out, I think.
There was a hand up at the back. Yeah.
Yes, it was a very interesting talk. I just wanted to ask, for the countries in Europe that with higher GDP per capita, what's their privatization like in comparison to Britain as a opposite sector?
Yeah. I cannot think of a country in Europe which has privatised as much as we have. We went way, way, way overboard on it. So I cannot think of another country that's privatised all its water outside of Scotland, privatised its transport system so much, privatised so much of what was left of its social housing, privatised its universities. No other country in Europe do you have to pay over £9,000 a year to go to universities. They're not private businesses. Privatised its schools. Academy schools are basically privatised. I can't think... There will be countries in Eastern Europe which were advised to and will have to an extent, but I don't know of any that did it as much as we did. And you can, if you want to be optimistic about it, somebody was going to do it the most, you know, and you know, and there could be old lefties like me saying, if you privatise water, they will literally get you to drink your own shit. But what's happened is they've proved that that is what actually happens. It's a little bit like the optimistic... apologies to anybody who likes Brexit, but the optimistic side of Brexit is that a European country was going to leave, because you're always free to leave. It could have been Greece, it could have been Bulgaria, right? Could have been, and whichever country left was going to really suffer badly, particularly if it's got a land border. So at least it was kind of us. We took the hit of showing what happens if you do leave this block, which is not a perfect block, it's a rich men's club, it's not necessarily nice, but being in it's better than being out of it. But the only way to prove that being in it's better than being out of it is for a country to leave and show what happens. And we did it. But having done all of this, having taken the hit, having done the stupid stuff, we can stop doing it now? My most charitable to Margaret Thatcher. In 1986, Margaret Thatcher signed the World Health Organization goals for health, which were to halve health inequalities by social class for babies and between areas by the year 2000, in just 14 years. Because she believed her trickle-down policies would do that. And you can see why. Because it's quite hard, if your health is already very good, to make it better. But if your chances of dying is higher... So at least Margaret Thatcher believed her policies were going to help a majority of people. But she was completely wrong. Right? And we now know that our health inequalities became much bigger. But no, I can't... Somebody could tell me, there probably is somewhere. But you do not. You do not nationalise your basic monopoly utilities. That is stupid. That's just handing over money and allowing a private company to blackmail you. You shouldn't privatise your education system. It should be, in my view, 99% state. I'm happy with roughly 1% private, just to check things aren't going badly wrong, because, you know, if it's really bad, they flood there. Your health service should be roughly 99% state. 10% of people every year in the UK use private healthcare now. Right? It's really expensive and slightly dangerous. Housing should be about 50% state, 50% private, in my mind. And you can see across the continent how this is done in different ways. And you can see European countries where there is no homelessness and where you cannot rent out privately because there are rules in the Netherlands that say this is how much you have to charge and this is the quality that you have to provide your tenants. Oh, and you can't evict them either. Right? So in a sense, social housing is provided through private individuals. And there are lots and lots of good things in other countries. And the irony is that most people in those countries don't recognise the good things because they're used to drinking water that's clean. And they can't imagine having beaches with their own sewage on them. So you don't notice what's working when it works.
Yeah.
You mentioned climate change is not very high in people's concerns. I think that's not very surprising because people believe what they see. Now we're really only seeing the effects of climate begin, perhaps in the last year, perhaps the last 6 months. And all the indications are going to get worse, like this period we've had of rain, a lot of which is due to the climate change.
Yeah.
Probably hotter summers. You know, we're going to see more. What do you think will happen?
So I've got a couple of the most controversial part of this book. Particularly, I work in the Department of Geography and Environment. We have more than 400 staff. More than 100 of the staff in my department are climate change scientists. And
Which university?
University of Oxford.
Okay.
And and the first name author on the 1.5 degrees IPCC is in my department. And it's real. It's really rising. It's emissions have been not just rising but accelerating slightly globally. Temperature's not just rising but accelerating slightly. More worse weather events, more floods, and so on. At the same time, the number of people who've died due to climate-related disasters, in the 1950s, it was about 77 per million per year. And then it's fallen every decade, and in the 2020s, it's 1 person per million per year has died due to climate-related disasters, of which we have more. But now, when there are enormous floods across Pakistan, 1,600 people die, not tens and tens and tens of thousands. So one reason it's hard to get people to worry about climate change is that we have mobile phones and early warning systems. And so the worst effects of disasters are not as bad as they used to be. Martin Sixsmith, the former BBC scientific correspondent, was speaking last week in my department and talking about 40 homes being burnt down on the edge of London in a heat wave recently. 40 homes. Now that's bad, but far, far more than 40 homes are burnt down a day in the UK normally. This is what's tricky. You can point to the extreme, but the everyday experience, the number of children who die because of poverty, far, far, is orders of magnitude higher. What I find amazing is that our politicians, who are pretty vile, have managed to make a series of agreements. They don't stick to them necessarily, but they are at least generally, not just in the UK, but in other countries, trying to hit their 2030 targets, their 2040 targets, their 2050 targets. It's going to get worse. It could be 2 degrees, 2.5 degrees. The scariest thing is that the models are not that reliable. So it could be much worse, or quietly say something might feed back so it's not quite as bad as it's expected. But there are a lot of countries where it is being addressed well. Finland's a good example in Europe, but China. And maybe China is doing this because it wants to have an influence in the world and take over for the United States. But it didn't have to do this. And it isn't without a cost in China to decarbonise as fast as it actually has.
I wasn't really asking that so much as wondering, because you said it's fairly low in people's perception.
Yeah.
And I imagine it's going to come up.
The problem is it's been dropping.
Yeah.
Because too many people think it's been crying wolf. 12 years to save the world.
Yeah.
So we've had a crying wolf thing. There's also a danger. I have a section about conspiracy theories, which is partly fun. But there are lots of people in the world who think it's a conspiracy theory and climate change isn't real. And we're lowest on that. What's fun about the conspiracy theories is you can never be quite sure if they are conspiracy theories. So YouGov did the survey, and one of the conspiracy theories was that the Russians had interfered with the American election. But between sending the survey out and getting the results back, it was revealed that the Russians had interfered. But the reason that YouGov were running it was that they wanted a measure of anti-Semitism. So they asked the classic question of, do a small group of people meet in secret and run the world? Now, the problem even with that question is, there was a small group of people who meet on yachts and do run the world. Peter Mandelson was meeting small groups of people. He may not have been running the world. But when Tony Blair went and prayed with George W. Bush and decided to bomb a country. They didn't involve other people in that decision very much. So once you're worrying about people's perceptions of things like climate change, you've got to think of people's overall concerns and worries about all kinds of potential real and unreal conspiracies. And that makes people very, very concerned. Yeah.
I think more I was asking that it's going to be rather more in your face as real climate disasters begin to accumulate. And how will that do to public opinion? Not to politicians, public opinion.
It's tricky because the better we deal with them. So if you take Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Katrina was dealt with, but was dealt with really badly by the public authorities in America. You know, they were racist, they were scared of riot, they didn't treat people well. And that's a climate-related disaster because it involved flooding. Not climate-related, but the tsunami in Japan, because when that hit, the response of the government in Japan and people was, how can we help everybody? Which made the disaster much smaller. So you have this problem of the better we get at predicting where it's going to be and dealing with it, the less people are likely to worry about it. I don't have an answer for how you get out of that.
I see the trend you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks very much. Danny, thanks very much for everything you've done over the years to highlight the damage and the harms done by greater inequality. I mean, it's your books are fantastic. Give us fantastic ammunition in that. I wonder if you can say a bit more about the distinction between income inequality and wealth inequality, because it feels like there is a difference. And I mean, I'm all for finding signs of optimism, causes of optimism, but it does feel like in our lifetime, certainly in the UK, but I think globally, the system has driven a massive concentration of wealth and power to smaller and smaller minorities. And I don't see that. I don't see much sign of optimism about addressing that without systemic. I mean, it feels systemic. It's not Madison or Morgan between. I mean, it feels like the system does that drive.
Yeah.
And I think one of the depressing things is that when the kind of hundreds of billions of pounds that we would need to get back to the kind of levels of inequality that we had in the 70s, I don't see politicians grasping that.
Yeah.
And even when they promise us growth, when they say, well, we can address inequality, we can have redistribution if we have some growth, we also know that the benefits of growth tend to go to the better off anyway. So even that isn't that helpful. So I wonder if there's a distinction between income
and wealth.
Inequality and wealth inequality. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So short answer. Income inequality matters much more for short-term effects. So it's income inequality, that's the money you get every year, and how wide that is, that predicts how people's health is bad and other things. Some of those most equal countries in Europe by income inequality, the Nordic countries, have quite high wealth inequality, but that doesn't seem to have a detrimental effect. I think it's partly because people have wealth they're not allowed to use. It's a bit like saying, in Scotland, you can own a large estate, but anybody can camp on it, and you've got to keep the paths clear. That's a very different kind of wealth to other wealth. There's also a kind of Nordic deal where the wealthy are allowed to keep their wealth. So the house prices in Helsinki and Oslo in the centre are high. You can keep your wealth, we won't touch it, but you don't touch our politics on that. There was a point when the Sunday Times Rich List included 1,000 families, and then they cut it to 250. And that was partly because the other 750 weren't doing so well. I'm veering a lot on optimism. Every year Oxfam produces a report about the billionaires, which began with the billionaires can fit in a bus and they have half the world's wealth. And every year every year the report says about how things have got worse. And often they have got worse, but kind of even if they haven't, the report says they've got worse. We now have 3,000 billionaires. Musk has $1 trillion, I think, dollars for the first time. The really, really good thing in my mind is that 20 or 30 years ago, you'd have to be in a room like this to have people who talked about billionaires or multi-billionaires with disdain. Today, I never meet anybody who's impressed by a billionaire, who says, thank the Lord that that person owned that tech company and did this. There's an incredible change in attitudes in my lifetime to the very rich. It used to be they can't have become very rich. Bill Gates. Bill Gates must have done something really, really good to have had all that money. That was, when I was younger, and isn't he nice, he's funding vaccination programs. Bill Gates was a clever accountant and had a monopoly over Microsoft. There was no great innovation. It wasn't a very clever system. But I think you almost have to go back to Bill Gates to think of anybody that somebody might say something nice about, or a billionaire. That doesn't mean we're going to deal, if you like, with the robber barons in the next 10 years. But we now see them as robber barons. We don't see the people that are profiting from Amazon as, we like having Amazon. It's highly efficient to have a van drive up your road and deliver things to you rather than you all drive to supermarkets. It just needs to be nationalised. Right? Well, it would have to be the European community. The UK is too small. But otherwise, we'll be paying a tax to Bezos and our children for the rest of their lives. And the other thing to say about wealth inequalities is that the real worth of housing in the UK, compared to wages and inflation, for the last few years has been dropping. We don't like mentioning it. I won't ask you to put up your hands if you're a homeowner. And you're doing fine if you're a homeowner still. But you're not as rich as you were a few years ago. That's a reduction in wealth inequality. Now, it needs to carry on and on and on. But these things do actually happen. Wealth inequality tends to lag income inequality by 10 years. So when income inequality comes down, wealth inequality comes down later, and dramatically. So there was a point in the 1940s and 50s when people couldn't sell large houses because people couldn't afford to heat them, so they wouldn't buy them. It seems incredible to think that happened, and the large houses were subdivided.
Sorry, do you want to...
No, I'm fine. I just want to make sure how long do we carry on? Because I don't want to...
Well, yes. Yes.
Should we do 15? Go to 5:30? Yes.
My question is the follow. The government say we need more immigration and more people to cover some war and live better. But the more people come to this country, we are more poor and more miserable. We are paying more tax this year than never I paid 30 years ago. So what is the excuse for this situation? Bring more people, more workers, more from India, Pakistan, Africa, because they need professionals, they need working people to work in the fabric, warehouse, and we are more poor and more poor and more poor, and the economy got down. Yeah. So this is my question. What is the point to bring a lot of people that have nothing to do with us? We feel more insecure, strange. I feel strange in England. I am from Europe, and all my neighbors don't have the same my culture. I don't speak with anyone. I feel isolated, and I finish to pay more and more every year in taxes. So I didn't see any progress on this. What is the idea of progress with misery.
Yeah,
This is my
so,
question.
yeah. Things aren't always directly connected. So, if you go back a long time, go back to the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, 1880s. Well, we were an immigrant country, so we were sending far more people abroad. But the biggest group of immigrants were from Ireland, by far the largest. And people then would say these Irish people are terrible and they're not like us, and so on. And then, by about 1905, you had a lot of people coming in from Eastern Europe, and people said they're terrible. And we tried to change the rules to evict them and not let them in. And many of them were Jewish. And you have this pattern of whoever it is comes at the time they came. So some of my family, they came from the West Indies. This was in the 60s. This is terrible. They're not our culture, the same kind of thing, which you'll hardly ever hear anybody saying now for somebody from the West Indies. What I never thought, what was interesting, in 2003, I think it was, Ireland, us and Sweden allowed people in from the A8 countries, from Eastern Europe, eight countries in Eastern Europe. And I never thought that people would start complaining about people who were whiter than them. But they did. And then we stopped people coming. Whenever you try to... Immigration control doesn't have any effect on the total number of people who come. It just changes where they come from. Enormous numbers of people come in and out all the time, and they stay when there's opportunities, and they leave when there's not. Which is why you can predict net immigration from how many births there were 30 years earlier. Right? Government immigration controls have no actual effect. It just changes who comes. So we get more people from India because we made it harder to come from the mainland of Europe after Brexit. It wasn't worth it to come.
What is the idea of Brexit? You said all European professional people back home, they are professional. And bring people from India, they don't have any kind of level of it. I don't know, I say by my experience, they don't have idea of the hygiene. I work with people that they don't know where bacteria are. They used to clean the kettle with the same brand they use the toilet. So they say, no, this bacteria is cross-infection. They don't have idea what is cross-infection.
Yeah, but this is an old...
So what is the idea to bring people from Asia?
People said exactly the same in 1905 about Jewish people bringing diseases in. Right? And they'll probably be saying the same in 50 or 100 years' time. Right? If they're not, if you don't hear this in 50 or 100 years' time, well, we'll all be dead. But those young people, if you're around in 50 years' time and you don't hear this argument about immigrations and disease, you're going to have to accept there's been massive human progress. Right? This is always
Last one. Yeah. Okay, last
What are your views about...
Yeah.
What are your views about the human capacity for conflict and violence, linked also with our capacity to push forward technological development? And I'm thinking particularly of our ability now to wage nuclear war. And that's hovering at the background of all of the events, the competitive events that the human society is involved in, particularly between the mega powers.
Yeah, slightly verging on optimism about this. I live in Oxford, which is pretty small. I grew up in Oxford. Right? I come to London quite often. I'm still quite amazed at all these people who don't know each other who get on trains and nobody's hitting each other that much. You know, it is odd. And in most of our history, we never lived this densely. You know, the fact that it is incredible. There are some nice curves of propensity to violence by sex and age. And men are just so much more likely to favour violence, be involved in violence. When they said there was a shooter, I won't say in Canada, right? But also, it rises dramatically at kind of age 18, 19, 20, 21 and so on, and goes down. But in some countries, the curves are the same shape by age, and everywhere men are much more violent than women. But in some countries, men are 10 times less violent than in other countries, which is, it is possible. There might always be something, but it really doesn't matter if it's innate. If you can reduce it tenfold, it hardly matters. We've developed the means of annihilating ourselves. It may sound a bit stupid to say it's quite incredible that we haven't dropped bombs since those two in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's required thousands of individuals to intervene at various points to prevent accidents and wars happening. And their stories are largely untold. We know about the nasty ones, the kind of Dr. Strangeloves who want war. And, we know about the idiots putting a fleet of weapons in the Eastern Mediterranean now. But we're never told the stories of the people who managed to prevent it. The other reason why I'm less pessimistic about this is recognising women as human, which really is just 100 years old and not quite completed. And that's part of my faith. But when I'm walking through Russell Square, if you know Russell Square, I think it's meant to be a bench on Russell Square where the nuclear physicist first realised that this was possible. And I think it was within 12 years of him sitting there on the bench in Russell Square and the first bomb being dropped. It's so fast to do it. And I would just hold some optimism about the fact Ronald Reagan was president at the time of the talks which began getting rid of over 80%, almost 90% of warheads. And Reagan was hardly... So what happened? And I'll end on this because it's really optimistic. And my PhD supervisor was involved. So my PhD supervisor was called Stan Openshaw. And shortly after 1981, he had a copy of the 1981 census. The government released two reports. One was called the Square Leg Attack Plan, which was which cities in the UK were going to be hit with the Russian hitters. And the other was a report called The Effect of a 1 Megatron Bomb. Stan he was a computer programmer, he took the Square Leg Attack Plan, he took the government report, and he wasn't even political, he was like a working class conservative professor. He just thought it was really interesting. He put the two together and discovered that 30 million people were going to be dead or dying in 2 weeks. That wasn't realised. People have said, but nobody had actually just done the work. I'm pretty sure that GCHQ then did it themselves. And it wasn't just Stan, it was other people. But it wasn't that hard to work out this is mutually assured destruction. And if you don't believe this, you can now go and visit the nuclear bunkers of Britain. There's one every 8 miles with a periscope, right? So that you can see where the mushroom cloud is and send it back. John Major decommissioned them all. It's in secret. But they're all decommissioned because it's entirely pointless having them, because there'll be no future. Now, we managed to get to that point. Right? Reagan, John Major. These are not your kind of warriors for human progress. Right? But some things are so obviously stupid that we're there. And that should give us some hope. But we have no idea how to live with 8 billion people, soon to be 9, possibly just 10, and then down 9, 8, 7, 6. Right? We're going to go through a hell of a shock. We're going to not become richer. We're going to have to deal with economies that no longer have growth, because you cannot have growth with falling population. But we should at least celebrate the achievements of the past rather than be miserable all the time and say the end is nigh. Because if we keep saying the end is nigh, then younger folk are not going to try and make the world better. And we need them to do that for us. Thank you very much for your patience with me.